going to get started. Thank you everybody for coming. My name is Brian Herzog. I'm the assistant director here at the library. We would like to thank David Brody for coming. He's been here a few times to talk about his books. He's the author of 11 books, and this is the 8th book in the Westford Knight series.
Yes.
Best-selling author, we're excited to have him, and a Westford resident. And before we get started, I just want to say that also in the back of the room is one of our trustees, David Rosslyn. So if anybody has any suggestions or complaints, see him after the program, or please see me. With that, thank you, and welcome, David.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you all. It's great to be back in Chelmsford again. So I'm going to talk tonight for the first title. You can see Columbus and the Knights Templar, Strange Bedfellows on the Way to Journey to America. I'm going to do about a half-hour review of what we call the Westford Knight legend. And then I'm going to move into the next half hour and talk about some more, some updates of that involve some of the stuff up on the screen here. But the Westford Knight legend, as Brian mentioned, I live in Westford, and we have a marker near the center of town, near the Abbott School. Many maybe have passed it, but basically it's a marker that memorializes what we call the legend of the Westford Knight, Knight with a K. And that legend is that in 1398, Sir Henry Sinclair, a Scottish prince, essentially island hopped his way across the North Atlantic, following the routes of the old Norse sailors, Leif Erikson, and left the Orkney Islands in northern Scotland up to the Shetland Islands, to the Faroes, to Iceland, to Greenland, across to Labrador, down to Newfoundland, and then to Nova Scotia. They spent the winter with the Mi'kmaq tribe, and then the following spring continued down the coast of New England to the Merrimack River. They came up the Merrimack into Lowell, had to portage a little bit, obviously, and then onto the Stony Brook. Do you know where Brickhouse Pizza is in Vinyl Square? There's a little like culvert, which is really the beginning of the Stony Brook River. It's about the size of this chair, the opening, but that's just back then, of course, it was wider. Up the Stony Brook and into Westford. Once in Westford, they got off of the Stony Brook River at the base of Prospect Hill, which is where the Stony Brook farm stand is, getting over closer to Chelmsford. Climbed that hill, and while climbing that hill, one of the Sinclair men, we think his name is Sir James Gunn, died. And to memorialize the death of Sir James Gunn, Sinclair asked his group to carve an effigy onto the rock ledge. And that's what we have. It's called the Westford Knight legend. You can see that's a sign we have in Westford that memorializes this. This route that Sinclair and his group took is the common route that the Norse took for hundreds of years prior to 1398. And I think we have trouble, I think all of us have trouble with the idea that the explorers might have been here before Columbus, because we all grew up with that. We grew up with the Easter Bunny and the Tooth Fairy and Christopher Columbus. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. But we got past the Tooth Fairy, and maybe we can tonight get past Christopher Columbus. So I ask you to go into this with a bit of an open mind. But if we remember, if we realize that Prince Henry Sinclair, although a Scotsman, on his mother's side was Norse. His mother was a Norse woman. So he would have had in his family history the old Viking charts and maps and oral history that allowed people like Leif Erikson to come across. We know Leif Erikson came as far as Newfoundland, okay? There's a lot of evidence that he came further down the coast, New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, and if he's that far, then perhaps it wouldn't be a big deal to keep going down to Maine and New England, okay? But you can see that route they came across, again, at least as far as here, and perhaps further down, and then Sinclair would have followed that route 300 or 400 years later. So that's the legend, and we have, the knight is carved here in this rock, this outcropping of rock. About 3 years ago, we had a big ceremony to enhance the site. We put plexiglass over it to preserve the carving. There's a life-size carving of Sir James Gunn. Members of the Sinclair and Gunn clans came. We had sort of a big day. But essentially, the important part is carved into this rock ledge is this. Here's our knight. Here's a rubbing of our knight. Everyone can see him here. He's got his sword, his head, his shield, his shoulders. And this sword, importantly, it's a two-handed Mel Gibson in Braveheart hit-you-over-the-head sword. Okay, it's not a dagger or a saber. It's a Mel Gibson sword, okay? It's medieval. That's important because obviously there's always a possibility this was carved in later times by some teenage colonists or whatever, but it's a medieval artifact. And chances are if someone's going to carve something, they're going to carve something that's contemporaneous to their lifestyle. Okay, so we have, this is the carving. Very similar to what we see in Europe with medieval grave knight effigies where they have their sword. So that looks like that. What we can still see very clearly today is the battle sword. The rest of the carving has worn away. which is one of the reasons why we put the cover over it. We got some pretty good photographs from back in the 1930s showing the head and the shoulder and the shield, but what we can really only see today is the sword. But you can clearly see the pommel and the blade and the crossguard. And like I said, it's a medieval, it's called a claymore, a hand-and-a-half battle sword. It may be that's all that there is. It may be just be a sword. It may be that maybe we're just imagining the head and the shoulders and the shield. But even so, it's an appropriate medieval grave marker. This is Prince Henry Sinclair's grandfather's grave marker. It's just a sword. So even if it's just a sword, it's a medieval sword, and it's an appropriate grave marker. The legend continues that they went back down the hill, continued on the Stony Brook for another mile or two to an area near the Stony Brook School in Westford. In the 1920s, where they overwintered, in the 1920s, a road crew widening the road found this, we call it the boat stone. And again, it's another medieval design. This is a boat called a Nor. You can see the oar holes, 184, and a crossbow arrow. Similar technique to the Westford Knight where it's not carved with a chisel, it's punched in. This artifact, unlike the Westford Knight, which is carved into the outcrop, this artifact we could send to a scientist for evaluation. And we shipped this out to Minnesota to a geologist by the name of Scott Walter, who some of you may know from the History Channel America Unearthed show. He hosted that on H2 for a number of years. He's able to take a look. He's a forensic geologist. He does a lot of work. He did work for the Pentagon after 9/11. He did work for Fenway Park when they were adding seats to the right field roof boxes. He has some really highly sophisticated equipment. He's able to take a look at the carved areas of this stone to determine, based on the weathering profile, how long it might have been sitting outside. Okay? The stone itself has been sitting outside for 12,000 years since the last ice age, since the ice cap melted. And during that 12,000 years, it's undergone a series of freezes and thaws, wind wiping it down. The grains have become rounded. The mica is worn away. Different things happen over the years. But the carved areas have only been out for a few hundred years, presumably. Maybe 300, maybe 400, maybe 600, we don't know. Walter's opinion was the weathering patterns are consistent with that of an artifact that's been weathering for 600 years. That's very important, because if we're in 2000 now, 600 gets us back to 1400. We're talking 1398, 1399. And this technique and this tooling is the same as the Westford Knight. So we have 184, we have an arrow. If you pace 184 paces from where the stone was found, we don't know which direction exactly because it's been moved, but in one particular direction, 184 paces, we find the remains of this 40 by 32 foot, we call it the encampment. It's a foundation. You can see it here. The thought is that that may have been where they spent the winter, that they took their boat, they flipped it over on its head, they built a little foundation, and that was what they used for a shelter. I'm a real estate lawyer by trade, so I know a lot about going back and looking at deeds and land records, and I went back to search the records for this area. There's nothing that shows any kind of colonial settlement there at all. So this is a mystery. It's something we need to explore. But this may have been where they spent the winter. So that's sort of where I started 12 years ago. Okay, this is where I first stumbled upon this. My daughter had come home from school in the 4th grade. They had heard the story about Prince Henry Sinclair and the Westford Knight legend. And I'm an attorney by trade, as I mentioned. So normally I don't care about things like truth. But this, I live in Westford, and my daughter's being sort of taught this in school. This stuff started to keep me up at night. And I started to wonder, is this more than just a legend? And again, my lawyer training sort of kicked in, and it occurred to me that if this is true, there should be more evidence. I mean, if these guys really did come here, there should be other evidence. It can't just be 1 or 2 artifacts. We're not going to rewrite the history books over what I've given you so far. But if you're my jury, I hope I have your attention, even though I haven't won my case yet. Because that's how I felt about it. I'm like, wow, that's really intriguing, and maybe it's true, but I need more evidence. So about 12 years ago, that's what I started to do. I went out to start to look for more evidence. Later on, I'm going to tell the story a little bit out of order, but I think importantly, when we're going to look at stuff that happened 1398, 1399, we are idiotic if we don't talk to our Native American friends, since they were here and they know. I've been able to become friends with this gentleman. His name is Black Eagle. He's a Wampanoag tribal chief. Black Eagle tells the story of how, basically confirms the story, tells the story of Glooskap. Glooskap is a fire-bearded prince. Picture a Scotsman with red beard, red hair. Fire-haired prince who came across the Sunrise Sea, the Atlantic, on a long, giant canoe being towed by a one-winged gull. And Glooskap arrived here. He taught the natives how to fish with nets. They built an alliance, and that's how it all began. And that's the version that Black Eagle tells, which is consistent with what we think of Prince Henry Sinclair. More specifically, Black Eagle says, and I quote here, Prince Henry Sinclair and the Templars were here, and they built the Newport Tower, which opens up two lines of inquiry, the Templars and what's the Newport Tower. So we'll get to that right away. But essentially, the important thing is Black Eagle, Native American oral history and legend confirms what I was beginning to believe was true myself.
So Sinclair is a redhead?
We think so. We don't know, but he's Scot. He's a Scotsman. So
Okay.
is that you who asked that question?
Yes.
Yes. If it's you, I'm going to say yes, because you don't. I'm going to ask. Yeah. No. We think that at least some of the Scotsmen on that ship we think were probably redhead. It's a fair assumption. So let's talk about those two things: the Knights Templar and the Newport Tower. First, quick history of the Knights Templar. Early parts of the 1100s, 9 French noblemen go to Jerusalem to protect pilgrims on their way to the Promised Land to visit the holy sites. Somehow these 9, within a generation, form this order called, we now know as the Knights Templar. It becomes one of the most powerful forces in all of Christendom for about 200 years. We're not sure what they found in Jerusalem, some kind of treasure, some kind of secret. They leverage that somehow into this incredible fighting force and this incredible oligarchy, this business enterprise. And then finally in 1307, on Friday the 13th of October, unlucky Friday the 13th, they were outlawed by the King of France and the Pope. And a bunch of them scattered and went underground. The leaders were in prison, and some of them tortured and killed. But for about 200 years, importantly, they were the most powerful force in Christendom. What happened to their treasure after they were outlawed, no one's been able to determine. There are rumors that a lot of the Templars, once they were outlawed, they went to Scotland. At that time, Scotland was not under the jurisdiction of the Vatican because Robert the Bruce, the leader, had been excommunicated, whole long story, but they got safe haven with Robert the Bruce in Scotland, and that many people believe their treasures ended up in Scotland. This is Prince Henry Sinclair's grandfather, 1330, his gravesite. It says, William de St. Clair, Knight Templar. I wish I had a better picture. I'm sorry, I don't. The point being, in 1307, the Templars are outlawed. In 1330, he's still putting this on his grave slab. It's sort of a dangerous thing for a family to do back then, but obviously shows his pride in being a member of the Templar. It turns out, member of the Templars. It turns out the Sinclair family, if you go back, have a long and intimate association with the Knights Templar. In fact, the founder of the Templars is a guy named Hugh de Payen, and he married, if you can see this right here, husband of Catherine de St. Clair. Okay, so the founder of the Templars back in the early parts of the 1100s married a Sinclair woman. So there's this long association with the Templars and Sinclair, and then going forward, many people believe the Templars reconstituted themselves as the Freemasons. Can I apologize? I'm not going to get into that too much, but many people believe that. And but we do know for a fact that the Sinclair clan, the leader of the clan, became the hereditary Scottish Rite Grand Master for about 200 years. So the Sinclair clan chief was the Grand Master of Scottish Rite Freemasonry. So going back, we have this association with the Templars. Going forward, we have an association, close association with Freemasons. Okay. Deep breath. Okay. So that's important. We get back to the 1398, where Sinclair and his group spent the winter in Nova Scotia with the Mi'kmaq tribe, and we have this really interesting association of these flags. This is a Templar battle flag. This is the Mi'kmaq flag. They're almost identical. Obviously, something's going on there. Okay, some kind of association. What I'm doing here is I'm slowly, again, my lawyer training, I'm building a case. I'm giving you pieces of evidence one at a time until at some point you say, enough. All right, stop. We believe you already. Maybe you don't say that. I don't know. That's my goal. The Newport Tower. So that's the next big thing. Remember, Black Eagle talked about Sinclair and the Templars built the Newport Tower. This is in Newport, Rhode Island. Some of you must have seen this before. Yes. And if you go there, the literature tells you it's a colonial windmill. Thank you for laughing. It's a windmill because anybody who's got an engineering background knows that's exactly the foundation you want on a windmill to withstand lateral forces, right? No, of course not. No one would build a windmill like this. This is a colonial windmill. This is in Somerville, Powderhouse Square near Tufts. This is exactly what you'd want, tapered to the top, a solid base. This makes no sense as a windmill, okay? The date of this, everyone agrees, well, not everyone, the colonial theory is sometime between 1675 and 1677 when the Easton Mill burned down. Okay. My theory is that they took this and they retrofitted it and put a sail on it temporarily to use it as a windmill. There's lots of evidence to indicate that this predates colonial construction. So obviously the Romanesque style in and of itself jumps out at you. You don't see many Romanesque style architectural buildings in colonial America. If you've been to Plymouth Plantation, same time period, everything's built in wood, right? Life at that point is too transitory. We're still trying to survive in what is, in many cases, the wilderness. We're still worried about the Native American uprising. In fact, this time period, 1675 to 1677, when this was supposedly built, exactly mirrors King Philip's uprising, Metacomet's Native American uprising. So during that time, almost half of Rhode Island was wiped out. I would posit to you that if you're going to build a stone structure during the uprising, you would not build a windmill, you'd build a fort of some kind. Okay? The stone construction I mentioned, it's out of character for colonial times. War conditions, the unit of measurement used to build this is the Scottish ell. A group I belong to called New England Antiquities Research Association, when the city of Newport back in 2008 was digging up this walkway, we jumped in there and did some salvage archaeology. We found a piece of mortar that had fallen off the tower. Mortar in ancient times was made by using seashells because of the lime. There was a piece of seashell still stuck to the outside of that mortar. We brought it to Woods Hole Oceanographic Society for carbon dating, 1420 plus or minus, 1400, perfect date. So again, not colonial, earlier. I think because of the Scottish measurement, the fireplace. That's another thing. If you're going to build a windmill, any kind of mill that you're gristing flour, and the last thing you want to do is have an open flame. Brian, are you from farm country in Ohio, or so? Anyway, kaboom! You don't do that. That fireplace, interestingly, has what we call a double flue, almost like devil's horns going up this way, and that architectural feature is unique to 14th century Scotland. So lots of things pointing towards 14th century Scotland on this, okay? Including, I'm going to talk about maps, architectures, and illuminations. Maps. Quick history of Rhode Island. It was settled in 1637 by Roger Williams. Remember, people know that story? He left the Bay Colony for religious reasons. He was a bit of an unorthodox Christian. And they finally said, get out of here. And he went down to Rhode Island and formed a new colony. That was 1637. By 1639, they had made their way down to Newport. This is the William Wood map of 1635. So this is before Roger Williams, before any colonists have arrived in Rhode Island. This is New Plymouth. This is Cape Cod. You guys can see that, right? Old Plymouth. That means New Plymouth is someplace over here, right? That makes sense? This is Narragansett Bay. It says right there. Here we have something called Old Plymouth. That's New Plymouth. That's Plymouth, England. What's Old Plymouth there? What it is the map maker's memory of some kind of European settlement from an old settlement, sometime long in the past of 1635. Again, it's as if there's a memory of some kind of European settlement there. The Newport Tower is right there. Okay. Similarly, this is another map, 1569, Mercator, the most famous map maker probably we have. A European settlement in Narragansett Bay, clearly European, 1569. So we've got Jamestown in 1607, Popham Beach 1607. We've got Roanoke in the 1580s, 1585, whatever. We're before any of that. Again, a memory of some kind of European settlement. They called it Norumbega, a European settlement in Narragansett Bay prior to colonial times. I would suggest this strongly indicates that there's some kind of European something going on in Narragansett Bay in pre-colonial times. I know what I think it is, but we'll get there. The tower. This is the tower right here. During that time period when they were doing the walkway, we jumped in to do archaeology. Like I said, we found the remains of post holes that would have surrounded the tower. We think that the tower is stone but had a wooden ambulatory walkway around the tower, similar to this structure in London called Temple Church. This is the tower. This is a stone walkway. It was wooden until World War II when it burned down, a wooden walkway. Also, we did some archaeology. We found this square. See the foundation there underground? That's there. Similar to what we'd have if there was a chancel. Again, a chancel here. We think that this looked like this and looked like this. These are both Templar structures from medieval times. And we think that's what that tower was originally here. The design matches Templar structures in Europe, not a colonial windmill. This is probably the most compelling, but also the most difficult piece of evidence to convey. I asked my wife tonight, should I leave this in? She said, you have to leave it in. So I'm going to try my best to explain it. There are 8 arches in the tower. Only one of them has a keystone. That keystone that we're looking at here is ovular shape and it's off color. It's orange. It's also a little bit off center. Can everyone see that? Here's a window. All the windows in the tower are pretty rectangular except for this one. You know, it's bad here, it's bad here. It's like your third grader, you know, trying to build something, right? It's not a good window. In fact, no self-respecting stonemason would ever allow that to happen. But we started looking at this a little more carefully because something really interesting happens on the winter solstice. The sun comes through that window at about 9 a.m. It forms a light box on the back wall of the tower, and slowly it creeps along. At about 8:30 it starts, and about 9 o'clock, that shaped window changes the light box into a perfect rectangle that exactly fits around that ovular stone. It only happens on the winter solstice at 9 a.m., which happens to be the monastic time of prayer. It's as if somebody reversed engineered that crazy shape and that unique keystone off center a little bit, reverse engineered it so that on the winter solstice we have this fascinating allegorical effect. If we think back to the way people thought in olden days, early Christianity or even pre-Christianity, the idea of superstition and pagan beliefs, December rolled around and the days started getting colder and darker and the sun get lower and lower on the horizon. December 19, 20, 21, okay? People were worried the sun wasn't going to come back again. On the 22nd, it's still really low on the horizon. On the 23rd, maybe it's starting to come back a little bit. On the 24th, yes, it's a little brighter. Let's have a party on the 25th, okay? What the church did was they took that pagan celebration of the winter solstice, the rebirth of life, and they piggybacked on top of it. We know that Jesus wasn't born in the winter. He was born either in the spring or the fall because we know the shepherds were out, and you guys have heard that story, okay? But what the church did is they said, let's take this pagan celebration, which really is a celebration of the rebirth of the sun, S-U-N, and we'll take it, we'll make it a rebirth of the sun, S-O-N. But think about what's really happening here. The sun comes in, and traditionally the sun is the male deity. The sun is the male. And it's coming in on the darkest day of the year, and it's fertilizing this egg inside the round womb of the tower. And we're getting a rebirth of life. It's a very allegorical thing, and it's a very esoteric thing. It's not something, obviously, the colonists would have done. The Puritans, I can't picture them doing something like this. But the Templars and Sinclair's, I'll talk to you later, Sinclair's family later built Rosslyn Chapel, which is a monument to paganism and all sorts of crazy stuff. But they thought this way, okay? So this is a fascinating feature of the tower. There's about 100 of us who go down every year on the winter solstice to view this, and I invite you to join us. You can reach out to me if you want to find out more details. We get on every year. About 100 of us watch this fascinating alignment every year. Matt, you've been there. Ken, have you been for that? Good to get you down there, okay. But it's really interesting. Once you see it, you sort of have the deep breath and go, wow, this obviously was planned. This can't be happenstance. But it points very strongly towards pre-calendar, because obviously if you had a calendar, you didn't need this to mark this. Christian, Scottish, and then Gnostic leanings. It points very strongly towards the Sinclairs and the Templar families. Are we okay on that? Is there any questions about that before I go on? Okay. So that's a really compelling piece of evidence, and you almost one of those things you almost have to see to really appreciate. About a mile downhill from the tower, by the way, is on the highest hill in Newport. There's this stone which was uncovered during a big Atlantic storm about 6 years ago. This boulder became uncovered, and you can read it here. It says, "In hoc signo vincis." Under this banner we are victorious. This is an old battle cry from Constantine during Roman times, but it was adopted later on by the Templars. This is their battle cry. So we have a Templar battle cry carved into a rock about a mile from the tower. And another piece of evidence. Another piece of evidence, not far from here in Tingsboro, near Vinyl Square, going down Route 3A, near the BU Corporate Center. On the banks of the old river, because the river is much narrower today than it used to be, but the banks historically, before industrial times, before so much water was diverted, were much wider. There's this minivan-sized boulder, and carved into it is a map of the Merrimack River coming in from Newburyport, hooking down. This is Tingsboro and Lowell going back up, and then all the way up to Lake Winnipesaukee. And on the back side, I can't show you a picture of it, but it's very similar to this lobster-like shape of Lake Winnipesaukee. I grew up in Laconia, so I know Lake Winnipesaukee very well. I used to sail that as a kid. This map, we think, was also left by St. Clair and his group. The weathering on this is hundreds of years old. Native Americans, importantly, didn't have metal tools to carve into rock. Okay? They couldn't have done something like this, and the colonists simply didn't. They had parchment and whatnot. This is another artifact that we think, as St. Clair continued up the Merrimack River, he may have carved this. Again, highly advanced weathering, metal tools. And also on the historic banks of the river. So it wasn't done in post-industrial times. Another artifact up in Maine. I'm just going to keep throwing these at you because there's a lot of them. Up in Maine, this was found in the 1970s. There's 3 of these stones. I only give you 2 here, called the Spirit Pond Runestones up near Bath. 1970s, about a mile inland on a little pond. Guy's out walking around the pond. He sits down and he starts kicking at the dirt and he finds these things. This is written in a runic script, Scandinavian, runic. It's still spoken in Iceland. It's a ship's log, and it talks about fishing and mending nets. It dates itself, 1401 in one place and 1402 in another. And a University of Maine archaeological team went to that site saying, wow, that's sort of interesting. And they found the remains of a sod house. And they dug it up and they carbon dated the floorboards of the sod house, 1406 plus or minus 5. And they couldn't make heads nor tails of it. They said, it's not old enough to be Viking. It's too old to be colonial. We don't know what it is. Well, I know what I think it is. It's perfect dates for St. Clair and his group, right? And remember, his mother was a Norse woman. She would have spoken runic, so people on the trip probably would have written in that script. Today, if you want to go see these, they're in a Tupperware bin in a file cabinet at the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms because they don't know what to do with these things. I wish they'd display them. So that's one of them. The second one is a map. And ignore that red arrow for a second. Can you see that arrow right there? This says Vinland 2-day sail. Vinland is where Leif Erikson went. We're not sure if it's Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, Maine. I think it's further south. I think it's Cape Cod because the sagas, the Icelandic sagas, talk about cattle grazing over a snowless winter. Can't do that in Newfoundland. Can't even have a snowless weekend in Newfoundland, right? And it talks about making grapes, making wine out of grapes. There's no grapes that far north. Cape Cod makes sense. No snow for the winter. If you're a golfer, you know that. Okay. 2-day sail. Here's the coast of Maine. 2-day sail this way. Where does that take us? Not to Plymouth, obviously, but where does that take us? 2-day sail from that direction from Maine. Yeah, no one knows because it doesn't make any sense, right? George's Bank or something, right? My daughter was in 4th grade at the time. This is years ago. She figured it out. We're having dinner. It's one of those, Renee, be quiet. The adults are talking. You know, little hands up in the air. Finally, we say, okay, Renee, what is it? She was reading a map about medieval pirates. And medieval, what? A book. I'm sorry, reading a book about medieval pirates that had a map in it. Thank you. A book about medieval pirates. And the map in the book was a treasure map. But the map in the book had east at the top. Because east is the direction of Jerusalem. And apparently in medieval times, Jerusalem being the most important place in the world, and everyone being Christian, you put it at the top. So if east is at the top, that's south. Vinland, 2-day sail south, Cape Cod, Narragansett Bay, aha. Okay, so that's a good clue also. Another artifact, this is in Narragansett Bay across on the other side, on the western coast of Narragansett Bay. This is one of those things you have to wade out to your neck to carve it, okay? But 600 years ago, based on changing water levels, that was on the shoreline. It's runic again, another inscription. And one of the things we hear all the time is, well, these could be hoaxes. You know, people could just go out and do this. But Like, you're going to go out there, wade out to your neck with a runic dictionary and a hammer and chisel, and it's just not the way people behave, okay? And there's too many of them, okay? This one is particularly interesting, again, because 600 years ago, that was on the water's edge, and today you'd have to wade out to your neck. So just, again, common sense. All of these eventually have to be analyzed in light of sort of the granddaddy of all rune stones, R-U-N-E, runic, R-U-N-I-C, okay? This was discovered back in the 1890s in northern Minnesota, the Kensington Runestone. Has anybody heard of this, seen it on TV? No, okay. 1890s, a farmer in northern Minnesota is out clearing his land, and he pulls up a tree, and intertwined in the roots of this tree is a grave slab-sized stone. This is it. Translation, you can read it, 8 Goths, 22 Norwegians on a voyage of acquisition from Vinland of the West, blah, 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 year 1362. So how in the world did they make it all the way to Minnesota in 1362? Well, you can get in there. You can go up through the Hudson Bay, or you can go up to St. Lawrence. You got a portage and whatnot, but apparently they did, unless this is a fake. So for about 100 years, the debate went back and forth. Is it authentic or is it a fake? Is the farmer, again, because farming in northern Minnesota in the 1800s was so easy, and he had so much free time on his hands. Okay, did he do this? It's possible, I suppose. So in the early 2000s, this is our friend Scott Walter again. I mentioned him earlier. This is how he first got involved with this stuff, but he happens to be in St. Paul, Minnesota. So the museum sent the stone to Scott and said, Mr. Walter, can you put this stone in your lab and put it under your microscopes and tell us how long that's been outside weathering? Remember, it was brought inside in the 1890s. Walter says it's been in a weathering environment for at least 200 years prior to the 1890s, prior to when it was discovered, which brings us back to the late 1600s. It's at least that old. It's been outside since at least the late 1600s and probably earlier. Well, who in the late 1600s could possibly have carved that? Again, the Native Americans didn't have iron tools, metal tools, and of course they didn't speak runic. There's really nobody else out there, maybe than an occasional French fur trader who also wouldn't have spoken runic. So in Walter's mind, it must be, because science is sort of the be-all and end-all in his world. He's a scientist. In his mind, it is what it says it is, 8 Goths and 22 Norwegians on a voyage of acquisition in 1362. Well, the quote-unquote expert said, well, thank you, Mr. Walter, but we have a few problems with a couple of the runic characters that are carved on this stone. We think it's a hoax. We think the farmer did this in his free time, and he made a couple mistakes. Just like if you guys were to go out this weekend with your hammers and your chisels and your runic dictionaries, you might make some mistakes because you don't speak runic. You might dot your T and cross your I, which is what they said this guy did. They say, they being the linguists, that this is an extra mark. The X is a common runic character, but this extra hook on it or barb on it is a mistake. It doesn't exist any place on any runestone in Europe or Scandinavia. And this, R makes sense, but the dot inside it, again, doesn't exist any place in Scandinavia or Europe. And these are mistakes that the farmer made, and they sort of prove that it's a hoax. So Walter, being a scientist and sort of knowing what he knows about the rock, he says, I know the rock is authentic. He got on a plane and he flew to Gotland. Remember, 8 Goths and 22 Norwegians. The Goths live on an island off of Sweden called Gotland. During medieval time, the people who lived on Gotland were Cistercian monks. They are a monastic order. They happen to be the sister order to the Knights Templar. The Templars fought and traded. The Cistercians prayed and farmed. But they would have been the scribes. People in medieval times were not literate unless you happen to be a monk. So the thought was that these guys probably came on the journey, 8 Goths. They were probably the scribes and the religious leaders. So Walter goes to Gotland, and he starts crawling around in the graveyards and churches of Gotland, and he finds the dotted R, the R with the dot, the one that the expert says does not exist. We've proven it's a hoax because that doesn't exist. That doesn't exist. Hoax. Well, Walter says, guess what, guys? Here it is. I found it in Gotland, right where I thought it would be. Oh, that's pretty good stuff. I said, well, what about the hooked X? And he said, all right. And he got on a plane. He came to New England. He looked at, this is where I met him in 2007. He came up to look at the Narragansett Runestone in Rhode Island and the Spirit Pond Runestone in Maine. Guess what? They all have hooked X's. Here, matches the one here on the Kensington Runestone. This was discovered in the 1970s, this in the 1980s, this in the 1890s. They're separated by over 100 years of discovery and by over 1,000 miles of location. It's an awful elaborate hoax, if that's what it is. And Walter's conclusion, and I think he's right, is it's not a hoax. What we have here, sometime in the late 1300s, 1362, 1401, not sure about this, but probably the same time period, Westford Knight legend, 1398, Newport Tower, early 1400s. We have a cluster of dates that talk about a group of explorers coming here, and they're all using this same letter. It's some kind of calling card. It's either it's slang or it's some kind of important calling card, but it ties all these things together, and it's probably medieval Cistercians. And this, we call it the hooked X. That was their secret symbol. I think it's a pretty strong theory. Later on, when we enhanced the Westford Knight carving, about 3 years ago, we found the hooked X. It was right here, almost like a signature line where an artist would put his name. Right there, dot, dot, hooked X. This is important. I learned this in law school. When you're doing a theory of your case, you put all your evidence on the table. And when you build your case, you have to take into account every piece of evidence. You can't say that evidence doesn't make sense and throw it away. You're not allowed to do that. You can't take outliers and get rid of them. You've got to put them all back on the table. And then you build your case. Then when new evidence comes in, it better fit your theory, otherwise you've got to change your theory. So here's an example of new evidence coming in, and it's consistent with what we thought happened. Because we would have thought that there would have been a hooked X on the Westford Knight carving. It made sense. We hadn't found it yet. Boy, did I feel like an idiot when we did find it, because I spent a lot of time up there. Hadn't done a good enough job cleaning it. Okay? But there it is. So again, later evidence supports our theory and corroborates it. So if Sinclair were here, and we think now he is, and hopefully you're at least open to the possibility, why Westford? Okay? Importantly, and Black Eagle makes this point, that if he was here, and Black Eagle says he was, he would have had Native American guides. This goes back to Glooskap and making an alliance, because you didn't fight your way into the hills of Neshoba Valley or the Merrimack Valley. You didn't fight your way to Newport. The Native American presence was too strong. So there had to be some kind of alliance. Okay? But why Westford of all places? It's a good question. I mean, we all love Kimball's ice cream, but really, why Westford? Why would they have come? Three things. Where the Westford Knight carving is, it's near the top of Prospect Hill. This is something called the Newbury-Clinton Fault Line. The Neshoba Valley, Neshoba is a Native American word for hill that shakes. We're right here on a and this, by the way, this right here is where the Westford Knight carving is, right at ground zero. It's the Abbott School. We're on a very active fault line. Because of that, the Native Americans believe that this area, this fault line, this ridge, this area where the carving is sacred land. The earth shakes. We have these things called earthquake lights up at Neshoba Valley ski area. Some people report seeing these things. Essentially, it's energy released from the tectonic plates rubbing together. And you see these crazy lights sometime. But the Native Americans believed this was sacred land. And so it was neutral territory. It's the highest hill in eastern Massachusetts. And it's also sacred spot. So it's the type of place you'd bring your honored guests to come see. Make sense? You guys all have places you bring your guests to see. This would perhaps one of them. And that's right where the Westford Knight was carved. Okay, so again, it makes sense as a place, a destination point. As I mentioned before, highest hill in northeastern Massachusetts. If you take that quadrant right there, Blue Hill's higher, Wachusett's higher, but nothing here. So this was used as a sight line by colonists coming into Boston Harbor. Again, you can see in all directions, if you're going to bring your guests someplace, you want to bring them to the high hill. The highway, the Merrimack River. It was a highway in pre-industrial times. We're right off here on the Stony Brook. And then lastly, this is a history of Chelmsford, because as you probably know, at one point Westford was part of Chelmsford. But if you read books about Viking-era ships or medieval ships, there's about 20,000 nails in a cog. And if you cross the Atlantic in one of these ships, think about the pounding you take as you come across. About half of those nails become dislodged or broken. And so if you want to get home, the first thing you need to do when you arrive in America is find a supply of iron to make new nails. Bog iron. Who has one of the highest concentrations of bog iron in all of New England? We do. Westford and Chelmsford. We have Forge Village in Westford, one of the earliest industries. So again, it makes sense. The area where I showed that boat stone, I showed you that earlier, that's very close to Forge Village where the bog iron deposits are. So it would make sense that they would have found a place that they could make iron nails. Okay, so all that sort of holds together, along with, of course, wanting to get ice cream at Kimball's. Let's look back to the European side of this a little bit, to the Sinclair family. I mentioned earlier, Prince Henry Sinclair's grandfather was a Knight Templar. His grandson built Rosslyn Chapel in 1456. Anybody been there? Oh, it's a great place to go. Da Vinci Code. You've read the Da Vinci Code or saw the movie. Made famous by that. Remember, this is where the girl Sophie finally meets her grandparents. This is the big reveal that she's part of the bloodline. This chapel is the family chapel. This is the family chapel of the bloodline family, the family of Mary Magdalene and Jesus. This is their chapel. In 1456, Prince Henry Sinclair's grandson hid another secret in the chapel. The chapel, first of all, has things like little green men carved into it. It's not a Christian chapel like we think. It's full of Masonic iconography, pagan iconography. It's essentially the history of Scotland built in stone, including a nod to Grandpa Henry Sinclair, because he's got William, what he did, the grandson, he carved things like North American maize, North American aloe, North American flower called the trillium flower. He embedded that kind of stuff in the architecture of the tower. He couldn't do it openly because it was a secret mission, but he wanted people to know his grandfather was in America. How in 1456 would they know what these things look like unless Grandpa brought back drawings or samples? So embedded in the architecture. And in fact, if you go over there to Rosslyn Chapel, there's a very matter-of-fact information placard that says, in 1398, Prince Henry Sinclair went to Westford, Massachusetts. In fact, I spent a lot of time yesterday with a Boston Globe reporter who just came back from Rosslyn Chapel and called me up and said, what is going on? Over there, they act like this is common knowledge. And here we talk about it as being a legend. He's writing a story. It's going to come out on Monday, I think. I'm like, yeah, we're still fighting up the uphill battle here. But yes, in Scotland, very matter-of-factly talked about. Okay? So I want you to stop for a second because we're going to move into some controversial areas, okay? As if we haven't already gone into the controversial areas. But so far, what I've given you has been pretty factual. My interpretation on it might be a little bit skewed to the way I believe things, but I've given you pictures and evidence of things, right? We're going to move into speculative stuff for a second. And first of all, I apologize if this is offensive to anybody. This is some of that Da Vinci Code stuff. What's important to remember here is that what people believe is what is important, not necessarily what is true, because it's beliefs that motivate behavior, and it's that behavior that changes history. Whether it's true or not doesn't really matter for the purposes of today. What I'm concerned about is what did people believe? And in medieval Europe, some people believed in the union of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. We talked a little bit about the Da Vinci Code stuff already. This is a stained glass window in a church in Scotland not far from Rosslyn Chapel. It says down here, this is Jesus and Mary Magdalene. Their right hands are clasped in matrimony, and she's very clearly pregnant. Here's another one. This is in a medieval monastery, Cistercian monastery, again, the Cistercians. This is, you can see Mary Magdalene at the foot of Jesus' cross. Here's a blow-up of it. She, again, is pretty clearly pregnant. So what this tells us is that some people in medieval Europe believed in that whole marriage of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, the Da Vinci Code stuff, and that they had children. Whether it's true or not, again, it doesn't matter. It's what people believed happened. And that's where we get into all that Da Vinci Code stuff. But the Sinclair family is the family that Dan Brown talked about, and before that, a book called Holy Blood, Holy Grail, that Dan Brown based his book on, talked about. It's the Sinclair family. It's Rosslyn Chapel. These are the people. So on the American side of things, we have Prince Henry Sinclair coming over here 100 years before Columbus. Really cool. But going back to the European side, it's a continuum of that Da Vinci Code stuff. So we've got, it's fertile ground for fiction, as you can imagine. But we've got it on both sides. So getting back to this hooked X thing, in light of all of that, this hooked X becomes important. The traditional, again, symbology a little bit, the traditional symbol for the woman is the V. It's the womb, the chalice, okay? And the symbol for the male is the upside down V. It's the phallus, not the chalice, the phallus. And we combine those two symbols together, the V and the upside down V, we have the union of man and woman, the marriage of man and woman. And in medieval times, this was a traditional secret sign for those who believed in the marriage between Mary Magdalene and Jesus. The secret sign, okay? You have to be careful about this stuff because it can get you killed. This is during the Inquisition and whatnot. Okay, this kind of stuff wasn't done openly. So given that, when we add a little hook to that X, this is the X, and we add a hook, this is the calling card, this is our secret. What's that barb? What's that extra hook in there for? Anybody want to make a guess? Women usually get this. You can't, you know this already. Sit down, you. No, you can't either. Everyone else can. Anybody else make a guess? Child. This is the woman, and this is the child inside the womb, right? And it's a girl, because it's a V inside a V. This is who we are. This is why we came. Perhaps. This is Scott Walter's theory. This hooked X. This is who we are. This is why we came to America. We are the believers or the protectors or the carriers of this belief, this bloodline, the family secret, okay? The Sinclair family, that's the family. So I took all of that, the hidden history, the Templar treasure, all that Da Vinci Code stuff, all these artifacts, and 12 years ago I came out with this book called Cabal of the Westford Knight. It's a modern-day adventure story where the characters figure all this stuff out. They're running around. It's very similar in style to the Da Vinci Code. 9 years later, today, I went down the rabbit hole 12 years ago, and I'm still ferreting around in the dusty corners of history, you know, in desperate need of a change of clothes and a shower. Okay, but I've written 8 books in this series. But this one that I want to talk about a little bit tonight, in probably another 10 minutes, okay? This one continues. There's still some questions unanswered. For example, why does Christopher Columbus have a hooked X in his signature? And why does Columbus have Templar crosses on his sails? Part of the answer is, it turns out, Columbus, when he married into the Perestrella family. He moved to the island of Madeira, up in north of the Azores. His father-in-law was a high-ranking Knights of Christ explorer. The Knights of Christ were the successor order in Portugal to the Templars. He had an amazing library of maps and charts, which he gave to Sinclair as the marriage dowry. In addition, a neighbor of Sinclair's, in fact, Mahutin is the Yiddish word for it. It's somebody who's an in-law, who married into the same family as John Drummond, who's the grandson of Prince Henry Sinclair. So our guy Prince Henry, his grandson and Columbus are neighbors and family members here on this small island, presumably sharing maps, charts, and family history. So Columbus may have had access to these, probably did have access to these Templar / Sinclair maps. In 1477, Columbus goes to Galway on the western coast of Ireland. And he goes to this church, St. Nicholas Church, which originally was a Templar structure until it was rebuilt and expanded upon. There's things in there that remind us of Rosslyn Chapel, a Templar tomb, a Templar cross, an apprentice pillar, this skull and crossbones, which is the symbol of the Knights Templar above the door. He's there. While he was there, he witnessed, you can see this inscription, but he witnessed bodies which he thought were Asian bodies floating ashore after a storm on driftwood. It may have been the first time he looked westward and thought, Asian bodies, that must be China. But he started looking westward. In fact, according to his diary, quote, "In the year 1477, in the month of February, I navigated 100 leagues beyond Toul to an island as large as England. When I was there, the sea was not frozen, but the tide was so great as to rise and fall 26 brachias." Let's talk about this for a second. 100 leagues, that's 300 miles. 26 brachias, that's 50 feet. When Tom Brady comes back to pass, and he throws a sideline pattern 10 yards down the field on a 30-yard diagonal, is that a 10-yard pass or a 30-yard pass? Someone. It's a 10-yard pass, right? We gained 10 yards, even though the ball carried 30 yards. It took me a while to figure this out. If he's sailing 300 leagues beyond Toul, that doesn't mean 300 leagues from Toul. It means Toul, which at that time was defined as the westernmost part of the known world. At that point, western settlements of Greenland. 300 yards beyond that means further east. 300 yards beyond here is here, Nova Scotia. An island the size of England, that's Nova Scotia. 50-foot tides, the Bay of Fundy. Okay? Essentially, this puts Columbus right down here in Nova Scotia in the year 1477. Well, what's he doing in February in the North Atlantic? Well, the Titanic tried that in April. It doesn't work. Like, why would a medieval sail? It makes no sense until I stumbled upon this book, The Horizons of Christopher Columbus. This woman had a theory that Columbus, what he was doing was trying to figure out the world, the geography of the world based on longitude. Latitude was easy. Longitude was hard. Well, the only way to get accurate longitudinal measurements back then was during an eclipse. She figured out, and Columbus was all over this stuff, that in 1477, in February on the 13th, there was an eclipse, and you had to go really far west to see it. In fact, you had to go all the way to the southern coast of Nova Scotia. So in her book, she places, Molander's her name, places Christopher Columbus on the southern coast of Nova Scotia in February 1477. Okay? It makes sense to me, and I think that's why he knew to sail further south. He knew if he went north, he was going to run into North America. He thought if he went further south, he might be able to skirt it. But we've got Columbus in 1477, probably using Templar maps all the way to Nova Scotia. This was all speculation in my mind until I started thinking about the three names of Columbus's ships. We all know those, right? The Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria. Let's analyze those names. Because I think today it's still the custom. You buy a new boat, you rename it, right? Same thing in Columbus's time period. Santa Maria, that's easy. The Virgin Mary, easy one, right? La Pinta. In medieval times, La Pinta was another word for the painted one, and word for a prostitute. She paints her face. Prostitutes were called La Pinta. Mary Magdalene during medieval times was referred to as the prostitute, La Pinta. We've got the Virgin Mary, we've got La Pinta, Mary Magdalene, and then last we have the Nina, the girl. La Nina, the actual name of that boat before he bought it, was the Santa Clara, the St. Clair girl. We've got the three generations of the Jesus bloodline. The Virgin Mary, the mother. Mary Magdalene, the wife. The St. Clair girl, the daughter. Columbus was part of this belief set and was paying homage to it very subtly, but enough so that we could figure it out. Got another 10 minutes? Is that okay for everybody? Okay. If the vestiges of the Templars were here in 1398, 1399 with Sinclair, and maybe in 1477 with Columbus, was it possible the Templars themselves were here before they're outlawed? And this book came out about a year ago by a dear friend of mine named Zena Halpern, who just passed away, unfortunately, The Templar Mission to Oak Island and Beyond. She writes about how after World War II, some black ops guys working for the CIA in Italy at this monastery found this journal. It's written in something called Theban, which is a code used by the Templars. This is called, remember the name of that? Cremona. Cremona. It's in Cremona, Italy. Here it is again. These journals were apparently discovered by the Templars while they were in Jerusalem in the early parts of the 12th century while digging underneath the Temple Mount, the Temple of Solomon. And they found these journals, and they're written in Theban. And they had ancient maps which showed the way to North America. Again, this passage, you can read it. It talks about how they first stopped at Oak Island. If you've read The Curse of Oak Island, that TV show on History Channel, all that stuff. But essentially, most importantly for our purposes, there were maps that showed the path to North America. And so they got help from the King of the North. So again, the Norse knew their way to come across. The Templars took this journey in 1179 to come across to North America. This is all talked about in The Curse of Oak Island, these maps. When they arrived here, they found a female-dominated society, a matriarchal society in the mountains of the Catskills in New York. On the roof, so this will flash forward to the 1970s, 1980s, Zena and her group start researching this, and on the roof of a cave, they find this map. And the map lists 4 different symbols, 1, 2, 3, 4, along waterways. Zena and her group go out and they find each one. They find this yoni symbol, same as that. They find this menorah, same as this. They find this feather, same as this. They find the 5-handed octopus here. This is Hunter Mountain. They find all these along the riverbeds. These are all goddess symbols, female deity symbols. Something's going on here with female worship. Again, similar to the whole idea of Mary Magdalene being important, okay? At some point, they all became too old, and they called in younger people, quote unquote, me and other people. This is about 6, 7 years ago, asked us to continue the search. These were guys who were black ops agents after World War II, and they're now in their 80s, and they couldn't do these climbs anymore. So myself and a couple other guys were called in to help. One of the things we were shown was this map, these clues on the blade of what's called a swagger sword. These swagger sticks that they used to use in the military, walking sticks, you pull them out and there's a blade on them. So on one of these blades, there's clues. There's a rock with a table on it. Essentially, we followed these clues: rock formations, landscape features, astronomical alignments, up the Catskills. And we triangulated these clues, and we dug. And we came up with this stone here. We call it the in camera stone. In camera meaning in hiding. We figured those are latitude and longitude measurements and coordinates. When we first looked at it, it didn't make sense. It brought us to someplace in northern Ontario. But then we figured, aha, medieval times, the prime meridian wasn't Greenwich, Italy. It was Paris. You have to make an adjustment for Paris. And then it leads us to these coordinates, which bring us directly to a place in Montreal called the Basilica of Notre Dame. Many of you have probably been there. It's a beautiful basilica. This was already on our radar screen as a potential Templar site because it was built by the Sulpicians, and they are the descendants of the French noble families who founded the Knights Templar. And they have been clashing with the church back and forth for a long time. And they came to Montreal and they built this. So we already were looking at this as a possible Templar-related site. There are Templar crosses hidden in the basement. There's all sorts of stuff in there that screams out at us, come pay attention to me. Okay? Secrets are hiding. Who is this? This is a mural on the wall at Basilica of Notre Dame. Who's this? Quickly. Easy one. What? I'm sorry?
Mary.
Oh, you're good. Why do you say that? Most people think it's the Virgin Mary and Jesus. This gentleman thinks it's Mary Magdalene.
Kid.
Excuse me?
He said because of the kid.
Couldn't it be Jesus and the Virgin Mary? Doesn't look like her. Quick art history lesson. Here's our picture. The Virgin Mary, always depicted with her hair covered. She's always in blue and white. Mary Magdalene, long red hair down, orange and green. This is Mary Magdalene. That means this is the child of Mary Magdalene, perhaps the child of Mary Magdalene and Jesus. Why is it on the wall of the Basilica of Notre Dame? They're trying to tell us something. They're being careful about it, but they're trying to tell us about what they believe. Similarly, this is the pulpit. It's about halfway down because unlike, I have a microphone, but back in the 1600s when this was first built, of course they didn't, and the priest had to go. He was halfway. He needed to be heard, so he would stand halfway, and he could talk this way and that way. But above him, there's this symbol of the divine, the starburst, the sunburst. Above him, the priest is talking. He's looking up at the heavens, right? That's what that is right there. He's standing here. He's looking up at that. What it is this. It's this triangle. It's called the Delta of Enoch in Masonic terms. And these Hebrew letters are what's called the Tetragrammatron. Here it is, Yud, He, Vuv, He, the unspeakable name of God, Yahweh. Except for we're missing a letter here, right? We don't have the Yud. This Yud is missing. And a researcher up in Montreal first discovered this about 20 years ago, and she actually convinced them to take this piece of wood off to see if it was hidden underneath there. No, it's not. So what's happening here? The priest is standing there on his pulpit. He's praying not to Yud, He, Vuv, He, but just to He, Vuv, He. 3 letters. And those 3 letters spell Chava in Hebrew, Eve. He's praying to the Eve in the heavens. Not to Yahweh, to Eve in the heavens. So we've got Mary Magdalene and her son on the walls, and we've got Eve in the heavens. A lot to do with this whole idea that the Templars, Sinclair and his group, were interested in the worship of the feminine, the importance of the feminine in the divine. It wasn't all about the guys, it's about the women as well. That's why they came over here, we think. Okay. Anyway, what's really happening, what really becomes interesting, okay, what really sort of seals the deal in my mind, these guys, the Vatican banking scandal in the 1970s, facts, a Masonic lodge by the name of P2. It's a rogue lodge. It's not a real lodge, but it's a Masonic lodge. They ally with the Vatican, the mafia, and they form what's called almost a shadow government in Italy. They try to run the Italian government from within this lodge because they're worried about socialism. And these guys are far right-wing. A lot of them are fascists left over from World War II. The Vatican Bank, run by this guy named Archbishop Paul Marcinkus. He's at the heart of all this. He's an American from Chicago. He funds this whole thing. The Vatican Bank is funding this. They're laundering money for the mafia. They're funding this fascist government, this fascist shadow government. They lose $250 million. Everything blows up. The leader of the bank ends up hanging from Blackfriars Bridge. Okay? Marcinkus, then, to save his job, is implicated in the assassination of Pope John Paul I. It's crazy stuff. Somehow Marcinkus survives all of this. He keeps his job. doesn't go to jail. He's got something over the Vatican that allows him to keep all this. More facts. All the leaders of the P2 Lodge, including Marcinkus and the guy hanging from the bridge, Calvi, were given those swagger swords with those engraved maps. That's where they came from. Those carved swords came from these guys. Marcinkus, the journals that I talked about, that the Black Ops guys found in Italy, he quote-unquote buys them in the late 1970s. When I say buy, he shows up in New York with a bunch of mafia guys and says, I'm buying those. And the guy's like, okay. And the guy sells them, and he relocates his family to Ireland, and we've never heard from him again because he knows what the problem is. But Marcinkus wanted those journals, okay? And then using those maps, the maps carved on these swords, Marcinkus and his team climbed Hunter Mountain and were searching for treasures in 1978. And my closing argument is going to be this, that only the Vatican truly knows what's going on. This is the Vatican Library and Archives. That only they truly know what was happening during that time period. But when senior Vatican officials powerful enough to survive being implicated in the assassination of a pope, start coming to the Catskill Mountains looking for Templar treasure, I start paying attention. So with that, I did this, and then this comes out just a couple weeks ago, tying in all that swagger sword stuff. Okay? So I've been 62 minutes. I tried to be 60 minutes. I apologize. All 8 of these books are in basically the same family, this idea that waves of explorers had come to America before Columbus. But it's the first one, Cabal of the Westford Knight, and the last one, the Swagger Sword, that I talked about a lot tonight. They're available for sale. They're 15 each and 10 for anyone after that. I try to make them affordable. They're available on Kindle as well. I think we have some time for some questions. Hopefully you have some. But most of all, I hope that as my jury, that I may have at least a few of your votes, that there may be something going on in this country before Columbus that we don't really know about. It's time we started paying a little more attention. Yes, sir. You're you're MVP, the most valuable participant. Yes, good. Better than you. Yes.
And you were saying they were French Templars.
The Templars were founded by the French noble families.
How come the French king had erased them on Black Friday?
Well, he tried to. So so Philip le Bel, Philip the Fair, they raid the Templar treasury in Paris on October 13th. They get there and it's empty. It's gone. No one's there. The treasure's gone. We think the treasure left from a place called La Rochelle on the western coast of France. Probably went up to Scotland. Someone had warned the Templars they were coming. Eventually, a few of the leaders, such as Jacques de Molay, were burned at the stake. But for the most part, most of the leaders escaped. Does that answer your question? The French king, by the way, the French king owed the Templars oodles of money. And what better way to get rid of your debt than to kill your banker? So, yes?
The marker in Westford, is that the original location, or has that been moved over time?
That's the original location. That's part of the bedrock. So carved into the bedrock. And one of the reasons why we couldn't send that carving to Minnesota is part of the bedrock. Yeah, so we had to send the other stone, which we thought was associated with it, to get dating on that. So it's sort of like by association, we figure that might be the same date. Yeah. So that's still, you can park at the Abbott School and walk up the hill about 50 feet, and there's a nice sidewalk, and you can see what I just showed you in that picture. Is that a hand or just a finger there? Okay. Yes, sir.
The 4 engraved stones that were found on the riverbeds around Hunter Mountain,
Yes.
were the sites they were found to be significant?
I don't know. They were found in the 1980s before I came along. So essentially what they did is they found this map carved on a cave on the ceiling of a cave, and based on where the rivers ran, and so they searched along the riverbeds, and they eventually found all these things, which again sort of corroborates that made them continue looking. And we think that in the 1970s, Marcinkus and his group did find certain things up there. We went back and found a few more, but a lot of the places that we were searching based on these maps looked like they'd already been dug up. And so my theory is that Marcinkus found something. One of the things that's talked about in the journals as being buried up there is the ketubah, the marriage contract between the Hasmonean princess Mary of Migdal and Yeshua ben Joseph from the house of David at Cana. In other words, the marriage contract between Mary Magdalene and Jesus. According to the journals, there's a scroll that was buried up there. If Marcinkus were able to find the marriage contract between Mary Magdalene and Jesus, that would have given him probably the leverage to get himself out of trouble at the Vatican no matter what he did. Okay, so that's one of the possibilities, and that's right in those journals, and you read it and go like, oh my gosh. Like that's more valuable when you think about what that would be worth in a monetary way, and you think about like say $500 million, how much gold that would take. You'd have to fill up like this whole library. It'd be that's an exaggeration, but it's so bulky and so much, even if it's pure gold. It almost has to be something non-monetary if it were going to be hidden in a cave or underground or something. So, time for one more question? Then we'll go see the Red Sox game? No? No more questions? Okay. All right, well, thank you all very much. I appreciate you coming out tonight. Thank you.